Mom abandoned me for her new family, showed up years later demanding I pay for my siblings' college, and attacked me when I refused. For some background, my mom had me when she was just 20. My biological dad? He was never really in the picture. From what my mom told me, he didn't want kids, and since their relationship was only a few months old when she found out she was pregnant, she gave him the option to walk away, and he did. Their breakup wasn't pretty, and she decided not to push for child support, which suited him just fine. They both went their separate ways and never spoke again. Thankfully, my grandparents stepped in and supported her through it all. Thanks to their help, she managed to finish school and land a job. Over the years, she dated a few guys, but when I was about 8, she started seeing Bryce. They had worked together at one point, and after nearly 3 years of dating, they tied the knot. Bryce and I got along okay, not super close, but we didn't dislike each other either. We were just fine sharing the same space. For years after their wedding, my mom got pregnant, and everyone, including me, was thrilled. Looking back, I probably should have seen the writing on the wall, but I was caught up in this idea that my mom would always have my back. After all, she'd been through so much raising me, it just didn't seem possible that she'd turn away from me. Even though things started feeling distant between us after she married Bryce, I convinced myself it was just a phase and that we'd get back to how we used to be. When she was pregnant, I tried to be there for her, but she always seemed irritated when I was around. Eventually, I figured it was better if I kept my distance so I wouldn't stress her out. But apparently, I wasn't keeping enough of a low profile because about 6 months after the twins were born, she and Bryce sat me down for a serious talk. That's when they told me they couldn't manage with 2 babies and a teenager in the house. I had just turned 16, so legally, they couldn't kick me out without trouble. Instead, they framed it as a financial issue, saying it was becoming too hard to support everyone on their income. I didn't buy it for a second. 2 web developers supporting 2 adults, a teen, and 2 babies didn't sound impossible, especially since we'd been living comfortably up until then. It was clear to me they just didn't want me there anymore. Still, I tried to find a solution. I offered to get a part-time job to help out, but my mom shut that down. She told me they needed to save their resources for the twins because, in her words, they deserved it more. Not needed, but deserved. That stung more than anything. That's when it hit me, I wasn't wanted anymore. They didn't tell me where to go or what to do next, but they didn't have to. They'd nudged me enough, and my pride wouldn't let me stay where I was clearly unwelcome. So, even though they technically didn't force me out, it felt like the same thing. They backed me into a corner until I had no choice but to leave. I packed my things and went straight to my grandparents' house. They weren't happy about what my mom had done, but they didn't cut ties with her because they wanted to stay in the twins' lives. Since my grandparents were getting older, I couldn't rely on them financially, so I got a part-time job at 16. I'd see my mom and Bryce occasionally when they brought the twins to visit my grandparents, but they barely acknowledged me. They'd be polite, but that was about it. It was clear they didn't miss me. In fact, they seemed happier without me there, my mom especially. She looked less stressed, which broke my heart, but there wasn't much I could do about it. I stayed with my grandparents until I started college. Even then, my mom didn't help me. I had to lean on friends to move into my dorm because my grandparents weren't physically able to. I took out a student loan, but since my mom and Bryce wouldn't co-sign, they said they needed to save for the twins. I had to ask a relative for help. Luckily, one of my uncles stepped in. He agreed to co-sign as long as I promised he wouldn't have to pay a dime. During college, I worked non-stop alongside my studies to make sure I didn't fall behind on loan payments and could give myself a solid financial start after graduation. Once I began college, any contact I had with my mom completely fizzled out. She didn't even bother to congratulate me when I graduated. The only ones at my graduation were my grandparents. After finishing college, I started working and moved out to live on my own. I didn't want to burden my grandparents, who were getting older. Those first couple of years were brutal. I didn't earn much, but I still had to manage rent, groceries, utilities, chip away at my student loan, and try to save a little for the future. If I've ever truly lived on a limited income, that was it. Thankfully, things are much better now. I worked my way up in the company. It took years and a lot of effort, but I'm proud of how far I've come. Today, at almost 33, I hold an upper management position in the same company where I started. About 4 months ago, I got a huge promotion, and honestly, I kept it mostly private. I did tell my uncle, though, as a way to thank him for co-signing my student loan all those years ago. Unfortunately, that turned out to be a mistake. Apparently, my uncle met my mom and Bryce at some family event and told her about my promotion. He probably meant well, thinking it might inspire her to reach out and finally reconnect after all these years. But instead of congratulating me, she and Bryce showed up at my house unannounced, demanding to talk. It's important to mention that after I started college, I made peace with the fact that my mom wasn't coming back into my life. I blocked her and Bryce everywhere and cut off all contact. They never seemed to notice or care, and I rarely spoke to anyone in the family besides my grandparents. They respected my boundaries and avoided bringing up my mom around me. So when my mom and Bryce appeared at my doorstep, I assumed, naively, I guess, that they were finally here to mend things. But that wasn't the case. Instead of offering any kind of apology or acknowledgement of what had happened, they opened with how surprised they were that I hadn't told them about my promotion. That alone was baffling. Why would they expect me to keep them updated on my life after years of silence? Then came the real kicker. They expressed their disappointment that I had cut them out of my life over something as simple as them prioritizing their babies over me. They went on about how they'd expected me to be mature and understand why they needed to focus their time, money, and resources on the twins back then. According to them, I should have been more supportive instead of distancing myself when I moved in with my grandparents. It was like they were trying to rewrite history. They hadn't even given me a chance to say anything before the conversation shifted again, this time to how hard life had been for them lately. They explained that they'd started a business, which had failed miserably, leaving them in financial ruin. On top of that, with the twins now approaching college age, they were scrambling to figure out how to afford tuition for both kids. That's when it clicked for me. They weren't here to reconnect or make amends. They were here for money. They didn't waste much time getting to the point, though they tried to soften the blow by framing it in the most audacious way possible. They said they'd been offended when they heard I was doing so well and hadn't reached out, but I couldn't make it up to them by paying for the twins' college education. The sheer nerve of it left me speechless. They were essentially trying to frame this absurd request as if they were doing me a favor, giving me the opportunity to repair our relationship by covering the costs of 2 kids I barely knew anymore, kids who were, for all intents and purposes, strangers to me after all these years. I told them flat out that I wasn't going to give them a cent and that it was offensive they thought they could manipulate me into something like this. I lost my temper. I reminded them that they were the very reason I had to scrape my way through college, working countless hours while studying, because they had refused to help me financially. They made it clear back then that their money was for their twins because, in their words, those kids deserved it more than I did. And I never argued with them about it or asked them for anything after they made their priorities known. But now? After all these years, after they chose their path and left me to fend for myself, they had the audacity to think they could waltz back into my life and expect me to help them? I told them, point blank, that they didn't even have the right to expect me to speak to them anymore, let alone give them financial support. If they wanted to prioritize the kids they thought were more deserving back then, they could figure out how to use the money they saved by kicking me out to fund their college expenses. At that point, I was done. I told them to leave, and honestly, I regretted even letting them into my house. I had been foolish enough to think they might have come to apologize or try to make amends. Instead, they turned the whole thing into a guilt trip, trying to rewrite the narrative and make me out to be the villain. When I asked them to leave, they got offended and defensive. They claimed I wasn't innocent in all this, either. According to them, back when we all lived together, I was overly enthusiastic and annoying because I wanted to be involved in their lives. I was a teenager trying to hold on to my family, even as they were drifting away. How is that something to hold against me? Then they doubled down, accusing me of being just as selfish as they were by refusing their request. They claimed I was forgetting all the years my mom had sacrificed to raise me on her own and that this was my chance to repay her and show gratitude. They made it sound like I was somehow in the wrong for not stepping up now. But here's the thing, they weren't doing me a favor when they raised me. I was a child, entirely dependent on them, and I didn't have a choice. The second they decided I was old enough, they nudged me out the door, effectively kicking me out, and then didn't acknowledge my existence for nearly 2 decades. And now, after all that, they expected me to swoop in and save them? The argument spiraled. It got nasty and personal, and I eventually threatened to call the cops if they didn't leave my property. They finally left, but not without my mom throwing one last guilt trip my way. She said she had made sacrifices for me when I was young to be a good mother, and that this was the one time she'd asked me to understand her situation and let her prioritize someone else. She insisted I should have been more understanding, and now, I was painting her as the bad guy. That last bit has been messing with my head ever since. I've been replaying everything, wondering if I somehow expected too much from her or if she's just gaslighting me into feeling guilty. I'm mostly sure I'm in the right, but it's hard not to second-guess myself. To make sure, I decided to post here for some objective opinions. Am I the asshole for refusing to pay for my half-siblings' college expenses, even though my estranged mom and stepdad are struggling financially? Oh, and I also spoke to my uncle. I told him what he did wasn't acceptable. Even if he didn't mean any harm, giving my mom information about my life and especially my contact details without my permission put me in this situation. He apologized profusely and said he had no idea they were struggling financially or that they'd approach me like this. He said that if he'd known, he never would have mentioned anything about me. My uncle admitted that he was out of line. He agreed it wasn't his place to share anything about my life with my mom, especially without my consent. If we'd wanted to reconnect, we would have done so on our own terms, without anyone interfering. That said, I don't plan to cut him out of my life over this. He didn't have bad intentions, and honestly, if it weren't for him, I might not even be where I am today. Back when I needed a cosigner for my student loans, he was the only one willing to step up. Nobody else even considered helping me, but he did, and that's something I'll always be grateful for. If not for him, I wouldn't have made it to college, let alone built the life I have now. So, while I made it clear to him that what he did this time was wrong, I also think I struck a fair balance. I told him how I felt, but I'm not holding it against him. Things between us are fine now. In a way, I think I needed this situation to get some closure. I also talked to my grandparents about what's going on with my mom. They've stayed in touch with her over the years because they didn't want to lose contact with their other grandkids, which I understand. But they agree with me on this, they don't think what she's doing is right or justified. They said they'd try to talk to her and Bryce to get them to back off, and honestly, I appreciate their support. Update 1: It's been 9 days since I last spoke to my mom, but she hasn't let up. She's been sending me emails every other day, listing everything she's ever done for me since I was a baby, like she's trying to guilt me into believing I owe her something. I don't even understand what her point is. Raising me wasn't some grand favor, she was legally obligated to do it. And let's be real, she only raised me for as long as it was convenient for her. As soon as I became a burden, she and Bryce decided to cut me loose under the pretense of saving money for their future and the twins. Well, guess what? We're in that future now, and the twins are grown. If they're struggling, they need to figure it out for themselves instead of trying to guilt-trip me. At first, I ignored the emails, but a couple of days ago, I finally decided to respond. I told her everything I shared here, that she wasn't doing me any favors back then, and she certainly isn't owed anything now. I reminded her that she'd chosen her priorities long ago, and I wasn't one of them. Unsurprisingly, she didn't take it well. She called me ungrateful again, but I just told her she could call me whatever she wanted, it wouldn't change the facts. The truth is, she was a terrible mother, and that's why I want nothing to do with her anymore. After that, I blocked her email address. But of course, she created a new one and started sending me more messages. I blocked that one too, and I'll keep doing it until she gets the message. Honestly, though, I'm glad we're having this out now. It's helping me finally close this chapter of my life. When I let them into my house that day, it was because I was still holding on to some delusion that maybe they changed, that they were there to make amends. But talking to them reminded me exactly who they are: selfish, manipulative people who don't know what guilt or shame feels like. Now, I'm done hoping for reconciliation. Update 2 this morning, my mom pulled her craziest stunt yet. She showed up at my workplace. Thankfully, I wasn't there. I had taken the day off because I wasn't feeling well, and honestly, I'm so glad I did. If I'd been at work, I'm sure she would have caused a scene or tried to embarrass me. I found out when the receptionist called to let me know my mom was there, demanding to see me and refusing to leave even after they told her I wasn't in. The receptionist eventually put her on the phone with me, and I was already on edge, wondering what she might do. When she got on the line, I told her I was at home and warned her that if she tried anything funny at my workplace, I'd sue her so hard she wouldn't even be able to send her kids outside the house, let alone to college. I made sure I sounded as intimidating as possible, and I guess it worked because she immediately backed down. She tried to make a deal, saying she'd leave if I agreed to meet her in person. I shut that down quickly. I told her she wasn't in a position to make demands, and if she kept pushing, my company might sue her too. And trust me, they wouldn't be nearly as lenient as I've been. That seemed to scare her off, and she left shortly after. At this point, I don't even know what else she could try, but I'm prepared for whatever comes next. I'm standing my ground, and I'm not letting her or anyone else manipulate me ever again. It seemed like my threat to involve the law worked, at least temporarily. After I told my mom it'd be in her best interest to leave without making a fuss, she handed the phone back to the receptionist. I'm assuming she left because I didn't get any more calls or notifications from work about her that day. But let me tell you, it was a close call, too close. I realized I couldn't let something like this happen again, so I decided to speak to a lawyer. I needed to know if there were any preventive measures I could take. I wasn't sure if her behavior justified a restraining order since, technically, she hadn't made any threats, but I figured it was worth finding out. In the meantime, I could only hope that her showing up at my work was enough of a disaster to make her back off for good. Update 3 Well, I guess I don't have to wonder about filing a restraining order anymore because, after what happened, it's become very clear that I need one. Last week's stunt at my workplace was bad enough, but this week, things escalated to a whole new level. A couple of days ago, I came home from work, and there she was, standing outside my door. I was exhausted and not in the mood to deal with her nonsense, so I told her straight up that I wasn't interested in arguing and if she didn't leave, I'd call the cops. I even pulled out my phone and was ready to dial. But then, out of nowhere, she came running at me and tackled me to the ground. My phone went flying out of my hand, and before I knew it, she was trying to beat me up. All the while, she was screaming and cursing, blaming me for every single thing that had gone wrong in her life. I was completely stunned. It was like she had completely lost her mind. It took me a moment to process what was even happening, but once I snapped out of it, I managed to fight back. It wasn't hard to overpower her. I work out regularly, and I'm a lot younger and stronger than she is. Thankfully, my neighbors heard the commotion and came running to help. They called the cops and even held her down until the police arrived. When the cops got there, I didn't hesitate to press charges. She's in serious trouble now. I've already spoken to my lawyer, and we've filed for a restraining order. From what I've heard, Bryce has taken the kids and gone to stay with his parents. My grandparents told me that after he bailed her out, she was charged with a misdemeanor since I wasn't seriously hurt. Apparently, he confronted her about her behavior, and instead of taking responsibility, she turned on him and started fighting with him too. It's clear that she snapped. I get that she's going through a hard time, but that doesn't excuse her actions. She couldn't handle the fact that I'm doing well in life while she's struggling, and instead of dealing with her issues, she decided to take it out on me. Honestly, I refuse to feel bad for her. She made her choices, and she's the only one responsible for the mess she's in now. As for me, I'm moving forward. The restraining order should come through soon, and I've already started looking at bigger houses. I've been considering moving for a while since I'm earning more now, and after everything that's happened, this feels like the perfect time to make a fresh start. I really hope my mom gets the help she needs and figures out how to be a functional, normal person. But at this point, it's embarrassing to be associated with her. Even my grandparents have said they don't want anything to do with her anymore because she's been rude and dismissive toward them as well. She's managed to push everyone in her life away, and she has no one but herself to blame for it. At the end of the day, though, that's not my problem. She made her bed, and now she has to lie in it. My focus is on moving on and building the life I deserve, far away from all this chaos.